Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Boston. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. It began in the autumn of 1920, when a persistent fog lay heavy over Tremont Street and the faint smell of decay drifted from the granary burying ground. The city was uneasy that year. Influenza had waned, but fear still lingered in every corridor of the old districts. A modest undertaker named Edmund Harlow arrived under uncertain circumstances. He had taken over a small, narrow funeral home that bordered the ancient cemetery itself, a building so old that its foundation stones touched the outer wall of the graves. Harlow was neither wealthy nor well-known. His license had been transferred quietly from a firm in Providence, and his letters of reference bore faint signatures. City records from that season mentioned the sale of mortuary equipment and a single horse-drawn carriage, paid for in cash. The caretaker of the cemetery, Silas Mudge, wrote in his nightly log, "A man of somber nature now tends the dead. He works late, and his light burns where none should." The granary burying ground, as later historians note, had long been rumored to conceal older vaults beneath its surface. In fact, an actual crypt was rediscovered there in 2009 when a stone slab collapsed, revealing stairs beneath. The funeral home's ledgers, now kept in the municipal archives, list unrecorded transfers of bodies between cemeteries, entries marked only with initials and dates. There was one recurring note beside several: "Return beneath east wall." Neighbors soon noticed that Harlow's work extended far beyond daylight hours. The caretaker's daughter, Maribel Mudge, recounted in a 1940s testimony that she often heard hovels striking earth long after the midnight bell. "Sometimes," she said, "the air trembled like someone was breathing beneath the ground." By February 1921, odd disappearances began. A gravedigger named Joseph Wainwright failed to report for duty, and his shovel was found near the cemetery's edge. Constable Amos Reed, investigating the complaint, recorded disturbed soil by the Ellis family vault, a place whose marble door had been sealed since 1893. Reed's notes read, "Hollow underfoot, faint echo, no answer when called." When questioned, Harlow insisted the work involved relocating older coffins during reconstruction. However, Reed noticed that the undertaker's lanterns were often lit deep inside the cemetery, even when no exhumation permits had been issued. The next month, townspeople whispered of lights beneath the ground, small flickers visible through cracks between tombstones. Some said they saw a second figure working with Harlow, though none could identify him. It was during these weeks that Dr. Horace Belmont, a coroner from Cambridge, was brought in to inspect irregularities in the records. He noted that certain remains listed as transferred to Mount Auburn Cemetery had never arrived. "Perhaps clerical error," he wrote, "or perhaps concealment." By June, the caretaker resigned, citing illness. His resignation letter, preserved in the city archives, ends with a peculiar phrase, "The dead do not rest where he digs." Harlow remained undeterred. His correspondence shows he ordered additional timber and iron fittings delivered at night through the alley gate. In August, 2 delivery boys reported hearing a hollow knock from beneath the ground, as though someone answered from below. What they saw next would later vanish from all official records, except a single line in Reed's surviving journal. Reed's entry ended there, the ink trailing as though his hand had trembled. The following pages were missing, torn neatly from the journal. Some said the constable destroyed them himself. Others believed they were confiscated by city officials wary of panic. Boston in 1922 was still recovering from the echoes of older scandals, fires, epidemics, and rumors of grave robbers that had haunted the city since the 19th century. The Undertaker's activities could not be allowed to stir public unrest again. Official correspondence between the Department of Health and the Office of Cemeteries mentions anomalous excavations, but omits the address. The funeral home on Tremont Street was not named, yet the date matched perfectly with Harlow's tenancy. Witness accounts began to surface quietly in the months that followed. A delivery man, Patrick Dole, claimed to have seen a faint light moving beneath a cracked headstone near the east wall of the granary burying ground. He described the glow as the kind a lantern makes when the glass is sooty. When asked who held it, he could not answer clearly, saying only that the light moved like it knew where to go. Around this time, Dr. Belmont, whose earlier inspections had been dismissed, petitioned for a deeper inquiry into unaccounted remains. He compared death records from 1919 to 1922, discovering discrepancies in both names and dates. One ledger line simply read, "Reinterred per request of Undertaker H." No accompanying documentation existed. The doctor's notes mention a sealed corridor discovered behind a false wall in the basement of Harlow's funeral home, though his report was never filed officially. It is from Belmont's surviving letters to a colleague at Harvard Medical School that we know what he saw: a space below the foundation extending toward the cemetery, lined in stone and damp with seepage. No coffins, but marks where they had once lain. That same letter references the granary burying ground by name, suggesting the tunnel might connect directly to one of its forgotten vaults, a possibility long denied by city engineers who claimed the soil was too unstable for such construction. Reed, now ill and near retirement, confided to a friend that he had entered the lower passage one night by lantern light. He described hearing movement ahead, like a shovel scraping far below. When he called out, a reply came, not in words, but in two slow knocks. The constable's friend, a night watchman named Elias Frayne, swore he saw Reed return to the surface white-faced, clutching his journal as if it were evidence of a crime. "He said there was a room under there," Frayne told a reporter years later, "and someone still using it." By autumn that year, Harlow vanished. His rooms were found empty, save for a torn map of the cemetery and a small key on a string marked with the number 12. The back door to the funeral home had been left open, leading directly to the graveyard. Behind the structure, beneath the rotted boards of an old tool shed, investigators found the start of a stairway, the top 3 steps visible before the soil collapsed inward. It matched Reed's last note perfectly. City workers filled the gap with gravel and concrete within days, and all discussion ceased from official channels. The newspaper coverage, limited to a single column in the Boston Herald, labeled it a routine property closure due to health violations. The funeral home stood boarded for months after Harlow's disappearance, its windows shuttered and its door sealed by the city. A faint odor lingered in the alleyway, though no one could say from where it came. In late winter of 1923, a new caretaker was appointed for the granary burying ground, a man named Jonas Pike, who had no knowledge of what had occurred before him. He reopened the path along the east wall and began clearing overgrown ivy that had hidden the older stones. It was Pike who found a fragment of wood beneath the soil, roughly carved with the initials E.H. and a date, March 1922. He turned it over to the local constable, but no record exists of what became of it. The story might have ended there, buried like so many others, if not for the curiosity of a young archivist named Lydia Crane, who joined the Boston Historical Society in 1925. She came across the name Harlow in an unindexed ledger while cataloging burial transfers from the previous decade. Her marginal note still survives in the archive today. Repeated notations of below east wall, consistent handwriting, unclear purpose. Crane's report to her superiors prompted a quiet re-examination of city cemetery documentation. Among the papers she reviewed were Dr. Belmont's earlier correspondences, sealed since his resignation in 1923. One contained a sketch that appeared to depict a stairwell descending beneath the cemetery's wall, annotated with the words, "Leads to sealed vault under Harlow property." Crane's discovery reignited interest within small academic circles investigating the older burial sites of Boston, particularly those surrounding the granary burying ground. Historians even then recognized the site's complex network of burial vaults, later confirmed in excavations nearly a century afterward. In early accounts from Pike's tenure, Several workers described the ground near the wall as unusually soft. One gravedigger, Henry Sloan, said the earth sank like it remembered something heavy. Pike dismissed the stories until one afternoon rain exposed the edge of a wooden plank just beyond the boundary of the funeral home's foundation. When removed, it revealed not a coffin, but a square opening braced with timbers and descending into darkness. Pike sealed it again immediately, citing safety, yet later confided to Crane that he heard a low draft, as if the earth was breathing. By 1926, whispers returned. Children dared each other to approach the boarded house, claiming lights glowed beneath the floorboards at night. Crane, persistent in her research, attempted to locate surviving relatives of Edmund Harlow. She found none, though a single mention appeared in an 1899 census listing a boy of that name in Fall River, noted as apprentice to mortician. Beyond that, his trail vanished entirely. City directories from 1915 onward show no business under his name, suggesting that he operated under aliases. Her correspondence with Dr. Belmont, by then in poor health, produced one final chilling remark. He wrote, "The ground does not forget him. There are records deeper than paper, and they are written in dust." After that letter, Crane's investigation was halted by order of the Historical Society's trustees, citing unnecessary disturbance of sensitive archival material. She resigned within the year, and her name faded from public mention. Those who later examined her private papers noted sketches of the same stairway. In 1927, the boarded funeral home was quietly purchased by a private investor whose identity never reached public record. Some said the buyer was connected to the Board of Health. Others whispered it was the church itself, hoping to end curiosity once and for all. The structure was dismantled piece by piece, and the stone foundation beneath it was ordered filled with lime and sealed. Yet according to Jonas Pike, who still kept night watch over the adjacent cemetery, the workmen refused to finish the job. One foreman, Albert Frayne, reported that when they began pouring lime into the lower cavity, a hollow sound rose from underneath like wind escaping a tunnel. The men halted, and after 2 days the site was abandoned, left half-filled and capped with rough boards. Pike later wrote in his ledger that the boards sagged within a month, as though something below pulled at them. The city covered the area with gravel and extended the cemetery fence over it, merging both properties into one continuous plot. Officially, no funeral home had ever stood there. In the same year, a local paper printed a short feature titled Unclaimed Histories of Tremont Street, recounting minor legends of Boston's burial grounds. It included a brief mention of the missing Undertaker of 1922, dismissed as rumor. The granary burying ground itself was already attracting tourists. Guides preferred stories of patriots and poets to darker whispers. Yet beneath these public tales, correspondence between Pike and an anonymous inspector from the city's sanitary bureau revealed quiet alarm. The inspector described unaccountable sinkage near the east wall, and noted that a stone slab once sealed had shifted slightly each spring. He recommended deeper excavation, which was denied due to budget limitations. By the early 1930s, most who had known Harlow or Reed were gone. Belmont died in 1931 at a convalescent home in Newton. Among his effects was found a small wooden box containing glass slides, photographs of subterranean masonry coated in moisture. The negatives were labeled East Wall, 1922. The images showed what appeared to be a narrow corridor carved from brick and stone, one corner holding a wooden crate, half buried, its lid ajar. The photographs vanished soon after being catalogued by the Historical Society, never to resurface. During the Depression years, the area around Tremont Street saw construction for the new subway extensions. Laborers occasionally unearthed fragments of wood and corroded nails, which foremen attributed to old cellar remnants. One worker, Samuel Morey, later recounted in an interview that they struck an air pocket beneath the cemetery wall and briefly revealed a dark cavity before it was filled with cement. He claimed a foul odor rose from it. Not rot, but something stale and cold, like an old room suddenly opened. That account was published only once in a local pamphlet on Boston folklore, soon forgotten amid larger news. The granary site continued to settle, and each restoration brought the same quiet unease among those who dug too close to its edges. Some noted that tools left overnight were often misplaced by morning, found leaning against graves they had never touched. The Harlow legend faded from public record. By 1933, the memory of Edmund Harlow had all but dissolved from Boston's collective mind. The Depression had shifted the city's focus to survival, leaving little patience for whispers of an Undertaker who may or may not have buried more than the dead. Yet beneath that quiet, fragments of the case lingered in odd places: a misfiled property deed, a coroner's unsigned note, a single weathered photograph of the funeral home taken before its demolition. A young journalist named Thomas Keene, researching historical scandals for the Boston Post, stumbled upon these remnants while combing through the municipal archives. He became fascinated by the inconsistencies surrounding the funeral home and the vanished Undertaker. In his notes, later found in a box labeled Unprinted, Keene wrote, "Every name attached to this property is erased, every invoice half-signed, and yet the handwriting returns, looped, heavy, unmistakable. I believe Harlow wrote most of them himself." He interviewed surviving residents of the Tremont district, though few remembered details. One elderly seamstress recalled the man with sad eyes who always looked as though he had heard something from the ground. Another claimed she once saw a cart arrive at night, covered in canvas, and that Harlow had paid the driver double to tell no one where he came from. Keene's articles never ran. Editors found them too morbid for a public seeking hope. Still, he gathered testimonies from those who worked in the cemetery during the following decade. Most mentioned strange drafts of cold air along the eastern wall, strong enough to snuff out candles even in still weather. Granary Burying Ground's long history of shifting earth was well documented, its crypts collapsing, its stones leaning, but the precise section once adjoining Harlow's property appeared disturbed more than anywhere else. Keene noted how the city's own maps from 1920 to 1930 showed subtle redrawing of boundary lines, shrinking the cemetery by several feet toward the street, as if concealing a section too unstable to mark. His research led him to a retired mason, Gerard Lacey, who had worked on the subway expansion nearby. Lacey described hitting brickwork below the normal burial depth, laid in a pattern unfamiliar for the era. It wasn't supporting anything above, it was enclosing something. Keene pressed for more, but the old man refused to elaborate, saying only, "Whatever was meant to stay down there should stay." The journalist's final note before abandoning the project read, "Dr. Belmont's slides show brick identical to Lacey's description. The connection between funeral home and crypt is undeniable." Shortly after, Keene left Boston for New York, and within weeks his rented room in Beacon Hill was found empty, except for a rolled map of the cemetery and a penciled line descending beneath the east wall marked, "Stairs continue below." When archivists later catalogued his effects, they discovered several references to the Granary Burying Ground, always annotated in the margins. The city fears its own dead. No formal investigation followed, but the timing of his disappearance renewed the legend. Locals began referring to the sealed section as Harlow's Descent. Visitors to the cemetery reported seeing faint depressions near the old fence, like footprints frozen in stone. Some nights, guides claimed to hear knocking beneath the earth, 2 taps, pause. By 1936, the Cemetery Restoration Committee reopened the east wall for maintenance after repeated complaints of sinking ground. The city hired engineers to stabilize the soil, though none of the men assigned to the project lasted long. Most left after a single week, citing exhaustion, poor air, or what one called a heaviness in the lungs that don't lift even outdoors. Among the workers was Charles Devlin, a bricklayer with 20 years' experience, who later described his time there in a private letter to his brother in Lowell. He wrote, "We found old brick courses under the wall, much older than the city claims, forming a square mouth leading to blackness. We were told to fill it, but it seemed to breathe. When the cement poured, the air came up cold." The letter ends abruptly after a final line. One of the men dropped a lantern, and it kept burning under there far too long. This account remained unpublished until discovered decades later in an estate sale, but its handwriting matched Devlin's signature on the city payroll. A report by an overseer, Edgar Henshaw, notes the incident only briefly. One worker suffered dizziness, no injuries. East wall stabilized. Yet the official soil analysis conducted afterward recorded unexplained hollows at 6-foot depth. That same season, Jonas Pike, by then aged and nearly blind, was found dead near the cemetery gates with his ledger beside him. The final entry in his careful script read, "The steps are not gone, they wait." The ledger was placed among city archives, where it still exists, though rarely displayed. Historians who reviewed it in later decades observed marginal sketches of staircases, consistent with earlier descriptions from Reed's journal and Belmont's sketches. Each drawing differed slightly, as though the stairs changed position over time. Granary Burying Ground continued its slow decay, its edges fenced and re-fenced through the 1940s as the city expanded around it. During World War II, when blackouts dimmed Boston's skyline, night patrols occasionally reported glimmers of light inside the cemetery, despite every lantern having been removed. One officer, Edward Mullen, filed an informal memo describing 2 faint lights in motion below grade, east section, extinguished upon approach. He received no response to his report, but the memo was later cited in a post-war inventory of unexplained incidents. The few living who recalled Harlow connected the sightings to him by reflex, muttering that the Undertaker's work was unfinished. In 1947, the granary site was included in a survey of historic landmarks, prompting another round of clearing and documentation. A graduate student, Ruth Denholm, photographing gravestones for her thesis, mentioned finding a depression in the ground shaped like a spiral, as if the earth itself had once turned inward. She dismissed it as natural settling, but her field notes end with the sentence, "Faint draft near the east boundary, could not determine source." Decades later, those notes were rediscovered by historians studying Boston's older cemeteries, drawing parallels to reports of crypts beneath the same ground. The Granary Burying Ground indeed revealed one such crypt in 2009 when a slab collapsed, verifying long-held legends of subterranean structures. If Harlow ever built such a descent, no trace remains visible today. But the pattern of stories persists. Every few decades, by the early 1950s, Boston had transformed, yet the small corner near Tremont and Park still carried an air of reluctance, as if the city itself wished not to disturb what slept beneath. Old residents avoided walking by the east wall at night. Some said they heard a low metallic sound, like the clink of tools against stone, faint but steady. Local police dismissed the stories as the echoes of construction from the nearby subway line, though no work was recorded on those nights. A historian named Dr. Ernest Mallory, researching colonial burial practices, encountered repeated references to the Undertaker of the Wall while interviewing aging caretakers. He traced the legend through property ledgers and handwritten memos that led him to the sealed lot once belonging to Harlow. Mallory's diary, later donated to Harvard's Widener Library, records his impressions in stark language. "I stood at the fence above the supposed descent. The ground beneath me pulsed faintly, as though shifting water moved below, but there was no drain, no current, no wind." He described scraping soil near the base of the fence and finding fragments of polished wood with iron hinges, the remnants, he believed, of a trapdoor. Mallory arranged for limited excavation with city permission, but the work was halted abruptly after one day. The reason given was instability of the retaining wall, though in his private diary he wrote, "We found what seemed to be the rim of a staircase, but the steps were not made for human feet. The curvature was wrong, too shallow." His assistant, Clara Wensley, later recalled that when she held a lantern to the opening, a cold draft extinguished it twice in quick succession. Mallory's subsequent papers suggest his obsession grew. He compared the Harlow affair to known burial irregularities across the region, linking them to 19th century practices of body relocation after epidemics. He cited the granary burying ground's complex history, its crypts and secondary burials, as evidence that the Undertaker might have uncovered or reused forgotten tunnels that predated his own time. The granary's layered foundations, he noted, were among the oldest in Boston. But where others saw urban legend, Mallory found continuity, entries in multiple church registries, where bodies were marked as moved east, a phrase eerily echoing Harlow's own ledgers. The historian's correspondence with colleagues shows increasing paranoia. His final letter, sent to the Massachusetts Historical Commission, claimed that something still moves in the chambers under Tremont Street, urging that the ground be sealed permanently. 2 months later, in the winter of 1953, Mallory's house suffered a fire of unexplained origin that destroyed nearly all his notes. Only his diary survived, water-damaged but legible, ending mid-sentence. "I heard the knock myself. 2, then 2 again, beneath the floor." The commission dismissed his warnings as delusion born of overwork. Yet, within that same year, a section of the east wall cracked after heavy rain, revealing stones laid in an arc, identical to those in Belmont's photographs decades before. The city patched the break quietly, with no public statement, though workers reported a hollow sound before the mortar set. One laborer later swore that when the last stone was placed. In the years that followed, the city chose silence. Official memoranda about the cemetery's subsidence were brief, dry, and stripped of detail. The few who inquired further found records inexplicably missing or labeled restricted. By 1958, only fragments of testimony remained: an aging groundskeeper's recollection, a blurred photograph of the cracked wall, the smudged outline of what might have been the stairhead. Somewhere amid these forgotten files appeared the name Reverend Nathaniel Coyle, a retired minister who tended the poor in the North End. He claimed to remember Edmund Harlow as a quiet man who occasionally donated burial cloths for paupers' funerals decades earlier. "He worked alone," Coyle wrote in a pastoral letter preserved at the Diocesan Archive, and spoke often of mercy being deeper than the grave. The phrase echoed eerily through subsequent reports, as if describing not faith but excavation. The Reverend's letter also described visiting the funeral home in 1921 and being shown a lower chamber for the keeping of old remains until they could be properly blessed. No such chamber was recorded in any permit or plan. When Coyle revisited the site a year later, the floorboards had been replaced and Harlow was gone. The old priest's testimony remained buried in church files until rediscovered in 1959 by a seminary student studying Boston's urban parishes. That student, Alan Firth, tracked the location described in the letter and found the ground still uneven and the soil unusually dry despite rain. Firth contacted the Boston Historical Society, where staff confirmed the property's peculiar legacy. They referred him to the Granary Burying Ground archives, where Dr. Belmont's name surfaced once more, his notes catalogued beside city maps from the same quadrant. It was there that Firth noticed a penciled annotation invisible in most reproductions, a faint arrow drawn from the cemetery's east wall into the alley, labeled simply "The Descent." He included it in a short thesis on forgotten urban tunnels, but withdrew the paper before publication, claiming it lacked substantiated evidence. Rumors spread that he had continued researching privately. One account places him in the cemetery after hours in autumn 1960, carrying a lantern and a tape recorder. The next morning, his coat was found hanging on the fence, the lantern lying unbroken on the grass. No report of disappearance was filed. His family insisted he had left for Chicago, but the police inventory notes one item recovered from his coat pocket, a folded scrap of paper bearing the words "Still Open." After that, attention to the case faded once more. The east wall was reinforced with concrete, sealing even the cracks through which earlier drafts had escaped. By the mid-1960s, the ground above the alleged tunnel was paved with a narrow maintenance path, and nothing more was said of it. But among caretakers, the story lingered, of the Undertaker who built downward, of stairways that never quite stayed buried, of nights when the soil trembled without wind. Some said the granary itself breathed in rhythm with the city, a pulse beneath cobblestone and tramline, faint but persistent. And though no formal record acknowledged it, each time the ground was disturbed, by 1967 the tale had thinned to rumor, but certain archives still whispered it between their pages. In the Historical Society's restricted collection, an anonymous envelope arrived containing 6 black-and-white photographs of what appeared to be the underside of brick arches. The negatives were marked only Tremont East. Experts dated the film stock to the early 1920s, consistent with Dr. Belmont's era, yet no record of who submitted or developed them existed. The curator who catalogued the images, Helen Trask, later described her unease in a private memorandum. These are not cellar walls. The curvature suggests descent, not support. She kept one enlargement on her office wall for reference until a visiting engineer advised her to destroy it, insisting that the brickwork pattern belonged to no Boston infrastructure he recognized. 3 weeks later, the photograph vanished from its frame, and Trask left her position, citing ill health. The city, meanwhile, prepared the cemetery for its 350th anniversary, erecting new iron fences and installing interpretive plaques. Most of the east section remained closed to visitors, officially due to unstable ground. Unofficially, workers refused to clear it after dark. One caretaker, Leo Garvey, later told a folklorist that each morning he found his wheelbarrow moved several feet, its wheels sunk into freshly loosened soil. He also mentioned hearing a hollow ringing when he struck his shovel into certain spots, like tapping a lid. Garvey's statements, recorded in 1969 for a radio segment on local legends, were never aired. The producer found the tape distorted by a continuous, rhythmic knocking that could not be edited out. That same year, a small subsidence opened briefly near the fence line after heavy rain. Engineers documented the cavity as approximately 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, though Garvey insisted it was deeper before they arrived. He said he saw the upper curve of a stair edge, slick with moisture, before city crews poured gravel and sealed it. The official report used a different description, collapsed animal burrow, but the diagrams show something squared, not rounded. During restoration of nearby sidewalks, another worker claimed to discover a sealed drain running from beneath the cemetery wall toward the old funeral lot, clogged with silt, but lined with shaped stone rather than pipe brick. He removed a fragment and described its surface as smooth from handling. No follow-up inspection was ordered. The Granary Burying Ground reopened fully in 1970 with its new signage and manicured lawns, and the story of Edmund Harlow passed again into dormancy. Only in scholarly circles did his name appear, always footnoted, often dismissed as urban folklore derived from Boston's long tradition of burial mishaps. Yet in an obscure 1972 conference paper, a structural historian referenced the Harlow anomaly, comparing it to the hidden ossuaries of Paris, and noting similarities in mortar composition between recovered fragments and those used in early Boston construction. The link to the Granary Burying Ground remained unspoken, but the implication lingered. Beneath the city's most famous tombs might still lie another chamber. Through the 1970s, Boston's modernization pushed the old legends aside, but the east section of the granary remained curiously untouched, despite the city's constant rebuilding. Preservation budgets cited structural fragility, yet no engineer could recall conducting a full inspection. In 1974, a small team of graduate students from Boston University, led by Professor Alan Devereaux, sought permission to conduct non-invasive ground scans as part of an urban archaeology survey. The city reluctantly granted access for one weekend. Their equipment, primitive by modern standards, recorded a narrow void extending roughly 15 feet below surface, a line directly beneath the old boundary where Harlow's funeral home once stood. Deviation readings suggested vertical masonry, possibly a stairwell, but the data were inconclusive. Declarex, the equipment manufacturer, later requested to review the raw results, but Devereaux's assistant claimed the tapes were misplaced during transport. In correspondence recovered years later, Devereaux confided to a colleague, "There is air down there, not soil." The instrument caught an echo when the sensor pinged, a resonance like breathing. The team was never invited back. Shortly after, the city paved a thin access road over the section, effectively sealing it. Deferred maintenance became the official explanation for halting all future excavation. Devereaux published nothing on the matter and retired quietly in 1982, but his notebooks, archived at the university, contain hand-drawn cross-sections of a descending structure labeled Probable Vault, Harlow Region. That same year, local folklore circles revived the Undertaker story after a visitor to the cemetery, Margaret Leary, reported hearing soft tapping from beneath the ground while photographing headstones for a genealogical project. She described it as 2 knocks, pause, 2 more, precisely matching the pattern. Tattern noted in Constable Reed's and Dr. Mallory's accounts half a century earlier. The report drew minor attention from the Boston Globe, which ran a small Halloween feature titled Whispers Beneath the Stones. It summarized the myth of Edmund Harlow, the Undertaker who dug too deep, referencing historical details lifted from city records but avoiding speculation about tunnels. The piece included a brief quote from the granary's caretaker, who admitted privately to hearing odd drafts through the ground after rain. Within weeks, the caretaker resigned without explanation. The renewed attention prompted the Historical Society to revisit its holdings, where curators discovered that several original photographs tied to Dr. Belmont's work were missing, the same sequence thought lost in the 1931 fire. Only their catalog numbers remained, annotated in a later hand. Transferred to private custody, 1975. No record identified the custodian. Somewhere in that period, anonymous donations began arriving at the Society. Fragments of aged wood, fragments of metal fittings, and a single rusted key identical to the one recovered from Harlow's empty rooms in 1922. No sender address accompanied them, only the words, "From beneath." By the decade's end, the cemetery's stories had become part of Boston's tourist folklore, filed under unverified urban tales. Yet among archivists and historians, the pattern remained too precise to dismiss. Every 50 years, the ground seemed to speak again, the same place, the same rhythm. By the early 1980s, Boston's planners again turned to preservation, funding limited subsurface surveys beneath historical sites before further urban development. The Granary Burying Ground appeared on the list, though its east wall was designated off-limits after prior collapses. The firm contracted for the survey, Merit Low Engineering, nonetheless placed seismographic sensors nearby to record ambient vibrations. Their report, later suppressed from public archives, recorded recurring signals from beneath the sealed quadrant. Faint, rhythmic pulses at irregular intervals, distinctly mechanical, yet with no identifiable source. The technicians attributed it to subway interference until one reading captured the pattern twice nightly at the same hour, precisely 2:17 a.m., repeating for 6 nights. A junior technician, Ronald Keene, wrote in his notebook that the pattern sounds like someone below knocking with metal. When supervisors reviewed the notes, they confiscated the original data strips, replacing the entry in the log with a blank page. The firm withdrew from the project soon afterward, citing contractual misunderstandings. Yet whispers spread through the city's historical offices that something had indeed been heard. A retired councilman later remarked that the committee decided to let sleeping ground lie. In 1984, tourists visiting the granary began reporting strange tremors beneath their feet during quiet afternoons. The Park Service blamed trucks from Tremont Street, though one ranger admitted the sensation continued even on Sundays when the street was empty. That same year, a vandal toppled a headstone near the restricted section, exposing a sliver of old timber below the sod. Photographs exist, though rarely reproduced. The Boston Police Incident File describes the wood as oiled, unrotted, unusually preserved. No further examination occurred. The fragment vanished en masse, route to storage. A brief resurgence of local fascination followed. culminating in a late-night radio program that invited callers to share personal experiences at the cemetery. One elderly woman identified herself only as Marge from Dorchester and told listeners she had been a child in the area when the funeral home still stood. She claimed her father, a delivery man, once carried parcels to Harlow's door and heard scratching from underneath the floor, like boxes shifting. Her voice trembled as she concluded. He said the man wasn't burying bodies, he was storing them until he could take them down. The call was dismissed as folklore, but audio copies circulated among enthusiasts for years. Meanwhile, archival staff at the Historical Society noted another disappearance. Helen Trask's missing enlargement from 1967 reappeared anonymously in their mailroom, its surface warped by moisture. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, were 3 words, "Not yet sealed." The handwriting matched none of the staff. Analysis suggested it had been written decades earlier, possibly with iron gall ink, common in the early 20th century. The photograph showed only darkness, bordered by brick, yet faint light reflected along what seemed to be a curved stair edge. The Society stored it under controlled conditions, but restricted public access, labeling it simply Artifact 12, Origin Uncertain. To this day, it remains uncatalogued in digital archives, known only through. By 1987, the cemetery's east wall again showed signs of stress, forcing temporary closure for reinforcement. City engineers prepared to inject concrete under the ground, but the supervising architect, Richard Fallon, noticed irregular voids on the preliminary sonar. His internal memo, filed only briefly before being withdrawn, read, "Hollow chambers present beyond predicted depth. Pattern resembles descending corridor, man-made." When questioned by his department head, Fallon downplayed the discovery, claiming equipment malfunction. Yet months later, after retiring, he told a journalist from the Boston Ledger that he had lied. "There was a space down there," he said. "You could feel it under your boots, like a drum." The interview never reached print. The paper's issue that week was pulled for legal review. Only a carbon copy survived in Fallon's papers after his death in 1992. In it, he described hearing a noise like a wooden box sliding along stone when the cement pumps began. He insisted that the sound came from below, not the machinery. The crew chief, Louis Desroches, later confirmed hearing it too, adding that one of the men swore the ground exhaled cold air just before the void filled. None of the crew returned the next day. Desroches filed a brief statement requesting reassignment, ending with the phrase, "It doesn't want to be sealed." That same summer, a small sinkhole appeared several yards north of the reinforcement zone. Beneath it lay what workers described as old stair brick, still intact despite moisture. They filled it with gravel and poured over it, no record of further study. Rumors quickly spread through the preservation office, revived by a newly published compendium of Boston folklore that reintroduced the Harlow legend. The author, Dr. Samuel Peers, a folklorist from Brown University, drew heavily from public archives and oral testimony. His chapter on the Undertaker of Tremont linked Harlow's activities to a broader pattern of hidden ossuaries beneath colonial cemeteries. Peers referenced the granary burying ground directly, citing its history of collapses and the crypt discovered beneath its slabs decades later. Harlow, he wrote, may have been less a murderer than a custodian of forgotten dead, uncovering rooms meant never to see light. Though intended academically, the book gained popular appeal, and tourists began leaving coins near the east fence for the Undertaker's passage. Peers received letters from readers claiming new disturbances, faint tapping sounds, shifting soil, even soft drafts near the boundary stones. One correspondent, a maintenance worker for the city, wrote that during a rainy night in 1988, he saw condensation rising from a small crack by the wall, like breath. Peers included excerpts of these letters in lectures, but refused to claim evidence. He concluded, "Every 50 years, the ground itself remembers." Within months, vandalism increased. Candles appeared in the grass at dawn, arranged in a spiral. The city installed new fencing and barred after-hours access. Yet the rumor persisted that workers still heard muffled sounds below. The Undertaker's steady rhythm, always 2 knocks. Pause. By 1990, renewed development around Tremont Street brought surveyors once again to the perimeter of the granary burying ground. A utilities crew digging a shallow trench for cable conduit near the old East Gate halted work when the drill struck empty space. The operator described a sudden give, like the bit slipped into nothing. The opening was small, perhaps the width of a man's hand, but air rose from it, damp and cold. One of the crew, Dennis Kearney, dropped a pebble inside and counted nearly 6 seconds before it struck bottom. Supervisors filled the gap with concrete, but Kearney later told his wife he'd heard a hollow echo afterward, like it hit steps. His statement, though never official, circulated among his co-workers until the crew refused to return to that section. At the same time, a graduate student in history, Ellen Vargas, researching Boston's forgotten trades, stumbled across Harlow's name while reviewing property transfers from 1919 to 1923. Her paper, The Disappeared Undertaker of Tremont, traced connections between missing municipal records and archival letters from Dr. Belmont's era. Vargas corresponded briefly with folklorist Samuel Peers, who encouraged her to verify the granary references herself. On an early autumn evening, she visited the cemetery after closing hours, using credentials from her university project to access the site. In her field journal, recovered later among her effects, she wrote, "Ground uneven, air unusually still, heard what sounded like light tapping from beneath, steady, deliberate, not mechanical. 2, pause, 2, faint draft follows." The next entry is dated the following night. Returned with small recorder. The sound persisted, identical rhythm, originating below east section. I believe the cavity still exists. That was her final note. Vargas vanished 2 weeks later. Her university filed a missing person report. Though police found no evidence of foul play, her bicycle was discovered locked near the cemetery fence, recorder missing. The Historical Society quietly placed her name among its internal references to the Harlow matter, noting investigator presumed lost. Unverified rumors suggested a brief tremor shook the area that same night, though no seismic data confirmed it. Peers published a small obituary in a local historical newsletter, describing her as a scholar who listened too closely to the ground. In the years that followed, the granary east wall remained sealed, but visitors occasionally reported feeling vibration underfoot during guided tours. Rangers attributed it to subway reverberations, yet one internal report recorded the sensation on a night when all transit had been halted for maintenance. The report ends with a note. Witness described a feeling like someone walking below. The entry was never included in public records. Through the remainder of the decade, local lore settled into silence again. The Undertaker's tale became a Halloween attraction. Actors reenacted Harlow's descent by lantern light for tourists who laughed more than they listened. But among archivists and older caretakers, the unease never faded. When asked, they all repeated this. By the turn of the millennium, the city's preservation board initiated another round of digital archiving for Boston's oldest cemeteries. The Granary Burying Ground, now one of the most visited historic sites, received new lighting, security, and a paved walkway that covered the last traces of the old east wall. Workers who laid the foundation in 2001 described uncovering unmapped brick debris at shallow depth, some pieces blackened as if scorched. The site supervisor, Janet Corcoran, noted the bricks were older than surrounding structures, the mortar coarse and hand-mixed, 19th century at the latest. When she reported the anomaly, the area was backfilled overnight by order of the city engineer, who cited risk of collapse. No photographic documentation survives. Meanwhile, in the archives of Boston University, a historian named Dr. Malcolm Fry undertook a project to trace missing municipal correspondences from the early 1920s. Among hundreds of unprocessed folders, he found one marked Funeral Requisition, E.H. Inside were crumbling letters, an inventory list of wooden boxes, and a receipt dated 1922 for reinforced hinges, brass. On the back of one envelope, someone had written in pencil, "Do not open till silence ends." Fry cross-referenced the initials and realized they matched Edmund Harlow's license registry. His article, The Undertaker Who Vanished appeared in a 2003 issue of New England Historical Review and reignited public fascination. In interviews, Fry remained cautious, insisting that all documentary evidence points to an unsanctioned excavation beneath the cemetery wall. He mentioned the granary burying ground directly, calling it a palimpsest of the city's forgotten dead. Shortly after publication, he received an unsigned letter quoting one of Harlow's journal entries word for word. Below the dead is a room of purpose. The return address was blank, the postmark smudged. Fry showed it to colleagues, assuming it a prank, but archivists recognized the handwriting from old municipal ledgers. The following winter, tourists began leaving notes and small keys at the fence, believing them offerings to the Undertaker's passage. City staff removed them weekly, yet they reappeared, scattered like leaves after storms. Around the same time, digital recording enthusiasts began capturing faint audio anomalies inside the cemetery, subtle rhythmic tapping, low frequencies that repeated in pairs. Sound engineers attempted replication but failed. Local stations aired the phenomenon briefly under the title Boston's Breathing Ground. The broadcast drew enough attention that the city issued an official statement. No structural instability or underground cavity exists beneath granary burying ground. But the denial only fed the legend. Late-night visitors claimed they saw fog rise from one corner of the cemetery even in dry weather, curling like smoke from a narrow seam in the earth. One photograph taken during a tour shows nothing unusual except a thin, pale streak at ground level, its pattern unmistakably spiraled, as if air itself traced the shape of a staircase. Within months, the fence was reinforced, and access to that section was permanently closed to the public. Guides no longer mention Edmund Harlow by name, but among themselves, they still say that if you stand by the east wall at night. By 2007, technology brought a new kind of curiosity to the old graveyard. Amateur historians began using handheld ground-penetrating radar and thermal cameras, often without permits, posting their findings on online forums. Most images showed only roots, rock, or buried rubble. But one user, under the alias Archivist 1922, uploaded a scan that displayed a near-perfect rectangular cavity 12 feet below the surface, aligned with the same east wall, long sealed. The image spread quietly among local researchers before being removed within days. Some claimed the user's IP traced back to a Boston city office. Around that same time, a private security guard patrolling after dark reported hollow vibrations under pavement, near the fence, and the smell of earth as if freshly turned. Maintenance logs confirmed that at dawn the following day, a minor sinkhole opened at the same location, approximately 3 feet wide. Inside were fragments of hand-forged nails, a strip of decayed wood, and something resembling an iron hinge. City engineers again attributed it to ground saturation, though the week had been dry. Visitors who saw the site before it was patched recalled the faint shape of descending stone edges before workers covered it with asphalt. The pattern of rediscovery had become predictable. Every few decades, something shifts, a cavity reappears, and quickly it is sealed again. That same year, Dr. Malcolm Fry, now lecturing abroad, referenced the phenomenon obliquely in a symposium on urban memory and subterranean space. He spoke of a city that breathes through its oldest ground, citing the granary burying ground as metaphor. After the talk, a student asked whether he believed the Undertaker's passage truly existed. Fry paused before answering. The documents exist. Belief is unnecessary. Weeks later, he received a package with no sender. Inside was a small wooden box containing a brass key etched with the number 12, the same number once found on Harlow's original tag in 1922. Fry turned it over to university security, but the box vanished from storage soon afterward. Meanwhile, reports of faint tapping returned. During restoration of nearby drainage, a city technician recorded unexplained percussion noises transmitted through the pipes. 2 beats, pause, 2 beats again. The sound file circulated briefly among staff before deletion. A local historian who heard it described it as too rhythmic for coincidence, too soft to dismiss. When the granary's 2009 crypt discovery made headlines, a genuine 18th century tomb uncovered by accident, it reignited every old speculation. Newspapers mentioned Harlow in sidebars as part of Boston's buried legends, though official historians avoided direct connection. Still, the symmetry unsettled many. The date of the rediscovery, the location, even the shape of the uncovered crypt matched long-lost sketches from Dr. Belmont's archive. One volunteer worker later admitted he refused to descend the opening, saying the air inside felt lived in. After the excavation closed, the east section was fenced again, this time with cameras that stream only to municipal servers. Public tours now end several yards away. Yet some nights, passers-by swear the lights in that corner flicker independently of the rest. By 2012, the legend was no longer confined to archives. It had bled quietly into the digital age. Urban explorers, inspired by fragments of Fry's research and online folklore, began mapping Boston's undercity. Abandoned service tunnels, forgotten basements, sealed cellars. One small group, calling themselves the Descent Collective, posted grainy footage taken near Tremont Street, claiming to have found an unregistered crawl space beside a foundation wall that matched maps of the old funeral home lot. The video, less than 3 minutes long, showed only a narrow stone corridor, its air thick with dust and a faint rhythmic sound echoing from beyond view. Within hours, the upload vanished. Accounts linked to it were deleted. Rumors spread that the city requested its removal for safety and trespass violations. Weeks later, a reporter from the Bostonian Weekly, Caroline Ames, attempted to trace the group. Of the 5 listed members, only one, Sean Larkin, agreed to speak. In her notes, preserved with her editor's papers, he is quoted saying, "We thought it was just an old drain, but the sound came from below, not ahead. 2 knocks, pause, 2 more, like it was answering us." After the interview, he stopped returning calls, and Ames never published her article. Instead, she wrote a brief human interest piece on the granary's preservation history, citing the Granary Burying Ground's role as both historical landmark and repository of myth. She included a single line referencing a forgotten Undertaker whose work remains beneath Boston's oldest stones. Privately, however, she continued researching. Her drafts include a transcription of a phone message allegedly left on her office voicemail, a low metallic tap, twice, a pause, then twice again, followed by what sounds like a faint exhalation. She submitted it for acoustic analysis, but the recording was labeled corrupted. In 2014, a restoration team repairing drainage beneath Tremont reported a persistent void near the cemetery's boundary. Their instruments measured temperature differentials, indicating a small chamber deeper than expected. The foreman requested further probing. Permission was denied. He later told colleagues he lowered a flashlight into the crack and saw stone steps, cut narrow, spiraling down. His description precisely matched Belmont's 1922 note and Pike's 1930 sketch, though he'd never heard of either. City officials poured concrete the next day. Since then, that quadrant has remained sealed under reinforced slabs, and all future work orders redirect elsewhere. The granary tours now skip mention of the east section entirely, citing soil conservation. Yet locals say that during late evenings when fog drifts from the harbor, faint shapes appear near the fence, like a man in dark clothes standing where the ground dips, head bowed, hands at rest. No photograph has captured him clearly. Every image blurs at the edge. Some insist it's only mist and light. Others say the Undertaker still keeps his watch, guarding the passage he opened a century ago, the descent no seal could close. Beneath the stones, Boston. By 2018, the city's official guides no longer address questions about the legend. Policies directed staff to redirect inquiries toward verifiable historical context only. Yet curiosity endured. That autumn, a local filmmaker named Daniel Reeve began producing a documentary series on New England folklore. He intended one episode to feature the Granary Burying Ground and the long-dismissed case of Edmund Harlow. Reeve secured limited after-hours access and filmed several nights inside the cemetery, accompanied by 2 technicians and a ranger. According to production logs later seized for insurance review, all equipment functioned normally until they reached the east boundary. There, the sound engineer reported a persistent low-frequency resonance identical to a heartbeat. When they paused filming, the vibration ceased. When they resumed, it returned. Reeves' personal diary, found after the project's cancellation, reads, "We played back the recording. It wasn't electrical hum. It was pattern. 2, pause, 2. During post-production, one camera feed revealed subtle motion in the shadows, a shape resembling a man bending over an open cavity. The timestamp showed no crew present in that frame. The footage corrupted minutes later. The production halted after Reeves suffered a minor accident, falling through a soft patch of ground near the same area. Paramedics noted mild shock. He kept repeating, "There's space underneath, and it breathes." Insurance officials classified it as trauma-induced delirium. His unfinished film, The Undertaker Below Tremont, remains unreleased, though a few stills circulate privately among archivists. In one frame, faint streaks of light curve downward like steps illuminated from below. Meanwhile, a research student digitizing historic blueprints in the city archives uncovered a forgotten map of Tremont Street dated 1919. Faint penciled lines extend. Head from the funeral home's rear foundation into the cemetery margin, ending in a square labeled holding room. The find caused brief excitement before the document was reclassified as misdrawn. Yet copies leaked online, prompting renewed theories that Harlow's passage truly existed. Experts at Boston University compared the ink composition to municipal records of the same era. Results confirmed authenticity. Even so, officials dismissed it as a clerical draft never executed. In winter of 2019, restoration crews installing underground lighting again reported unusual drafts near the sealed section. One electrician described hearing a faint rhythmic knock through the conduit as he drilled, like someone politely asking from below. His supervisor told him to ignore it. That night, motion sensors triggered repeatedly in the same quadrant, though no movement appeared on cameras. The incident report was logged but removed from the public database months later. By then, talk of Harlow's descent had returned among Boston's historians and tour guides. Some said the Undertaker's story mirrored the city's own nature, layered, hidden, never at rest. Others claimed the knocking marked anniversaries of the original discovery, the ground itself marking its own passage of years. Whatever the truth, the east wall stayed quiet through winter, sealed under snow and silence. But when spring rains came, water pooled over that patch longer than anywhere else. When 2020 arrived, the centennial of Harlow's arrival passed without ceremony. The city, preoccupied with its own modern crises, paid little heed to the date. Yet among a few archivists and cemetery staff, a quiet apprehension lingered. That February, before maintenance shutdown swept the city, a worker photographing headstones for digital records noticed moisture spreading across the sealed east section despite weeks of frost. He described the pattern as circular, widening like a breath. The next morning, a faint sinkage appeared there, no more than an inch, but enough to tilt two nearby stones. Engineers filled it by noon, though one remarked in his report that the soil underneath felt loose, as if hollow. In the archives, an aging curator revisiting the Harlow file noted that several original documents, Dr. Belmont's sketches, Pike's final ledger page, and the 1922 property deed, had gone missing again, replaced with blank placeholders stamped transferred. When she asked the Records Division for clarification, they denied any movement. That spring, a series of faint tremors rippled across downtown Boston, too minor for instruments yet noticed by pedestrians near Tremont Street. Local news attributed them to construction vibration, but security footage from the granary's internal cameras showed gravel shifting near the east fence seconds before each tremor. One frame captured a small plume of dust rising from a hairline crack that hadn't existed the day before. The site was resealed overnight, the footage archived privately. That autumn, a lone researcher, Caleb Hensley, published a short essay online linking Harlow's legend to the city's geological records. He argued that recurring sinkages formed a rough spiral pattern converging on the same point, the east wall, and proposed that the underground chambers still affected soil density after a century. The essay, Desassad, appeared within days. Hensley's colleagues later confirmed he had left for a field trip to Providence and never returned. His notebook, recovered from his apartment, contained only one penciled line: "The stairs are shifting again." After that, silence settled once more. The granary's east section remained sealed, its surface smooth, its stories filed under folklore. Tourists photographed the famous graves of patriots and poets, unaware of the closed ground a few yards away. But locals still avoid it after dusk. They say, if you stand there long enough, when the city quiets and the streetcars fade, you can feel a slow pulse beneath the earth. 2 beats, a pause, 2 again. Some call it wind through old tunnels, others memory echoing through stone. Yet, those who've heard it insist it carries weight, as though each sound presses upward from below. Beneath the granite markers and paved paths, the Undertaker's passage remains unseen, perhaps untouched, perhaps still waiting. The records end as they began, with silence. But Boston's oldest ground is never truly